Do you go on a trip or tour a city for the first time without knowing where you're going, without looking at a map? Now perhaps maybe you do that. You're adventurous and you like to do that, but most of the time you want to know where you're going. You want to see how to get there, you want to see where the sites are, you want to have a map, so you want some type of directions to know where you're going so you can get where you want to go and you can see what you want to see. Well, the first section of our study deals with creating the environment for learning. And the first element of that is setting objectives and providing feedback. You see, objectives are like that map that you have. The map tells you and the students where you're going. Students will then know how the learning activities fit into the plan. They're not doing things just to keep busy, but are heading toward a goal. Now, our book gives 4 recommendations for setting objectives. First, set learning objectives that are specific but not restrictive. Second, communicate the learning objectives to students and parents. Third, connect the learning objectives to previous and future learning. And fourth, engage students in setting personal learning objectives. Now, these are the goals for these lessons on setting objectives, in fact. Our goals are that you will not only learn what these 4 recommendations are, but that you will learn how to apply them in your own classroom. So let's get started and go through these 4 points. First, set learning objectives that are specific but not restrictive. Now, they need to be specific enough that it's plain what students will know and be able to do when they finish. For example, learn how to write effectively is far too broad. That encompasses everything from kindergarten through college English. But if your objective says, write a paragraph with 5 sentences, including a topic sentence about the life of King David, well, that's too specific. You don't want students to leave your class at the end of the year saying, I learned how to write a 5-sentence paragraph about King David. You want them to know how to write a coherent paragraph. So you might say, write a paragraph about a single topic, including a topic sentence. You also don't want to make your objectives so specific that there's no flexibility in them. For example, you wouldn't want to say students will learn that the 3 main parts of a pipe organ are the console, the wind chest, and the pipes. But instead say students will learn the main components of a pipe organ. You see, that allows you to be somewhat flexible in deciding how many components you will include. And that might vary depending on the specific group of students you have each year. One year you may have students that are very bright, that maybe have some background in understanding the pipe organ, so you go into more detail. Another year you have students who've never seen a pipe organ, and you say, I want to scale this back to just 3 things or 2 things. So stating it this way doesn't lock you in to something that's too specific. Now, your learning objectives might be based on accepted external standards, such as Common Core or state standards, something like that. But generally, you're going to need to make these more concrete. For example, the standard that you're given might say, use the general skills and strategies of the writing process. But that is too general. You might instead have an objective that takes that and makes it more specific. For example, write informative or explanatory text to examine a topic and convey ideas and information clearly. The lesson or lessons that you teach then builds towards students being able to do that benchmark or that objective. Let's look at some examples, and I've taken these from page 7 of the book that we're talking about. There are some objectives here that are kind of like Goldilocks 3 bears. Some are too general, some are too specific, and others are just right. So first, here's one that's too general. Understand the fundamental concepts of growth and development. Okay, that encompasses everything as far as human growth, and I'm assuming it's talking about human growth and development. But something that's too specific would be describe the function of the respiratory system in 3 sentences. That is just too granular. So an appropriately specific objective would be identify basic human body systems and their functions. You see, that's going to encompass the respiratory system, but also the circulatory system and other human systems as well. Another example that's too general. Use movement concepts and principles in the development of motor skills. This would be for a physical education teacher, for example. And again, this is just so broad, it covers everything practically that a physical education teacher would teach. Something that's too specific, though, would be explain how the principle of overload applies to training for a basketball competition, including at least 5 details in your explanation. See, this is going to end up being something very specific that just applies to basketball, for example. And then the appropriately specific term would be apply the physiological principles that govern, maintain, and improve motor skills. Okay. This encompasses the very specific one, but it narrows the general one down to something that's more manageable. And also notice with these two that they are transferable. Notice that the very specific ones we've looked at so far, the respiratory system and the basketball competition, it only applies to that. It doesn't apply to other things that you may be studying. The appropriately specific ones are more transferable because they're more general, but they're not too general. Here's one final example. Too general. Use the process of science inquiry. That covers basically a whole science course. Something that's too specific, though, would be describe 3 observations about how bean plants grow using 4 pictures and at least 4 numbers. Again, too granular, and there's no transfer there. A student could leave your class and say, okay, I know 3 things about how bean plants grow and I can use 4 pictures and 4 numbers for it. But if they're talking about cabbage plants, or if they're talking about fruit trees, they have no concept. They're not able to do that. So an appropriately specific objective here would be record and describe observations with pictures, numbers, or words. See, what you're after is the skill of being able to record observations and then describe them appropriately. Again, this is something that's transferable, not only to bean plants, but to all kinds of scientific observations. Now, one thing that's important here is that we need to state our objectives in terms of student learning, not student activities. What are they supposed to learn, not what activity are they doing? Now, sometimes these might overlap a bit, especially if this is a skill-based class, because you might think, well, my objective is what they're going to do. They're going to be able to recite multiplication facts within a certain amount of time. That's an activity. And it's true, that might be your objective. But what we're talking about here with student activities are particularly specific student learning activities, things that you would do, techniques you would do in the classroom. Here's an example. Look in a Bible handbook and write the historical setting of Colossians. Now, that is what the students are going to do. That's the student activity. But you don't want them to leave class and say, I learned how to look in a Bible handbook and write the historical setting of Colossians. Instead, you want them to have a more general concept and more general skill here. So we don't want to be doing this one. This is a student learning activity. Instead, you might say, know the reasons for studying the historical context of a book of the Bible. See, again, this is transferable, it's general, and it's in terms of what the students are going to learn, not the classroom activity they're going to do. Your objectives need to be more like the second one, not like the first one. So in the next video, we're going to look at the other 3 steps in setting objectives.